Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the History Projects Out of the Archives series. My name is Tony Grima and I serve on the board of the History Project and work on our events committee. In case anyone here is new to the History Project, welcome. We are Boston's LGBTQ community archives dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing Boston's LGBTQ history. If you're interested in queer history at all, please be sure to follow us on social media to learn about our upcoming events and activities. For example, just last night, we finished a series of 3 panel discussions titled Gay Community News at 50, which was a collaboration with the Massachusetts Historical Society. All 3 discussions are available on YouTube, and I'm just about to drop a link there to the first discussion on YouTube. If the last nights might take a day or 2 to get up there, but they will be available. Let's see. We also wanted to mention that our holiday party is on Monday, December 11th at Club Cafe, so we'll be in person. Be sure to follow us on social media, visit our website, historyproject.org, to find out more about these and other upcoming events. We've got some good stuff brewing starting in January. And I also dropped in the chat a link to our store where you can buy some bar logos from defunct Boston bars on t-shirts and other items, I think, including like the one I'm wearing here from Sporters. So that link is in the chat too, if you're interested. Let's see. My final plug before we start is to thank you for your support and ask for your help. As a community archives that is funded by the community, any donation to the History Project directly supports our mission to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history. Gifts of any size will help us to do that. And you can make a donation at historyproject.org. But now on to tonight's event. It is my pleasure to introduce you to author Lucas Hilderbrand. Lucas is professor and chair of film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine. He's the author of the books Paris is Burning, a queer film classic, and Inherent Vice, Bootleg Histories of Videotape and Copyright, as well as the newly published book that we'll be talking about tonight, The Bars Are Ours, Histories and Cultures of Gay Bars in America, 1960 and After. Welcome, Lucas.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'd just like to begin by thanking Tony Grima and Joan Ilacqua from the History Project, as well as Michael Bronsky for support with research, but also reconnecting me with the History Project. I also want to make sure, can everyone hear me? Just nod or give a thumbs up. Okay, great. So the book just came out last week, and it's the first survey history of gay bars in America. Each chapter focuses on a different city, and each city does a different piece of the puzzle, focusing on a particular subculture, political issue, or genre of gay bar or nightclub. But today I'm going to be focusing specifically on the Boston chapter. So the Boston chapter focuses on questions of urban renewal, gentrification, and class conflicts, particularly between residents of the Bay Village neighborhood and the nightclubs Jacque and the other side. So what I'm presenting is about half of that chapter. It's a condensed version. And I'm happy to talk more about this chapter as well to hear your own stories, because you, I'm sure, know more about these venues than I do as a historian. And I'm also happy to ask or to answer any questions about the book more generally as well. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in just to keep us moving forward. So cities in the 1970s were subject to changes in urban planning policies and to new concentrations of gay residency. The emergence of what were then called gay ghettos, but now are more commonly called gayborhoods or gay villages, occurred in relationship to both forces. Then, as now, gay bars served as these neighborhoods' anchors and beacons. Macroeconomic shifts were felt on the local level and raised tense questions about who constituted the gay community, who could claim the right to occupy urban space, and who was excluded from both. Gay neighborhoods, as they emerged in the 1970s and after, have typically been understood as white gay male cultural phenomena that expose fundamental racisms, sexisms, and classisms. Critiques of gay gentrification in more recent decades have continued to focus on affluent same-sex home ownership, raising property values and displacing lower-income residents of color, or conversely has focused on super gentrification, wherein queer enclaves lose both gay businesses and residents when property values rise and straight families move in. And we've seen both happen in cities across the country. Until fairly recently, gay businesses were disreputable institutions that didn't have the political or economic clout to fight City Hall or developers. They were commonly casualties rather than drivers of urban change. In Boston, Jacques, with a maddeningly misplaced apostrophe between the E and the S, and the other side resembled what Elizabeth Lepofsky Kennedy and Madeline D. Davis have called street bars, which in the mid-20th century were a meeting ground for diverse elements of the sexual fringe, with a mixed clientele of working-class gay men, lesbians, straights, and trans and gender nonconforming people, as well as sex workers and pimps across races and ethnicities. These rough and tumble venues maintained an unapologetic visibility rather than aiming for respectability or discretion. This is what many historical gay bars were like, including the Stonewall Inn in New York City. Gay people and venues often reclaimed the abandoned territories of cities, such as downtowns, red light districts, skid rows, and warehouse districts that offered cheap real estate far from residential tracts where people might complain about noise and public cruising. These spaces could be queered because zoning there tended to be lax and they were off the radar of the so-called general public. But such zones were also viewed as undesirable or even disposable by city planners, developers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and other citizens who advanced so-called urban renewal projects. Gentrification, in contrast with urban renewal, was and is primarily a market phenomenon driven by banks and realtors that happens more gradually as housing values rise through in-migration, renovation, and reselling. New residents are drawn to gay entertainment zones because of their walkability, unique storefronts, and vibrant nightlife, yet they in turn often complain about noise, traffic, parking, and other quality of life issues. Scholars argue that nightlife operates with and against gentrification, and that the 1970s were the years in which militant gay liberalism began to assume hegemonic form, and that at its center were issues of violence, safety, and neighborhood. Urban renewal served to relocate congregations of sexual outlaws, whereas gentrification splintered queer communities into assimilable and non-assimilable consumer demographics. Scholars also argue that we need to understand sex districts and gay neighborhoods not only in terms of who lives in and or owns property in them, but also in terms of who patronizes their businesses, claims an identification with them, and, in Theodore Green's terms, experiences vicarious citizenship in them. Virtually no gay neighborhood has ever had a statistical majority of gay residents, property owners, or businesses. But these areas nonetheless attract a critical mass of visibly queer people who make use of the neighborhood bars, restaurants, shops, services, and public spaces, which then act as magnets for other queer people. Although all of these spaces and venues contribute to the area's vitality, bars have been the most regulated and policed, which has also made them the most politicized. In the early 1970s, Boston witnessed not only identifiable gay contributions to gentrification, but also class divisions within the LGBTQ plus community between gay homeowners and queer patrons of bars. Although parallels can be seen in numerous cities, Boston provides one of the earliest and best documented case studies to examine this history. Bay Village was one of the earliest neighborhoods in the country to gentrify through conspicuous gay male in-migration and home renovations. By the early 1970s, a prolonged dispute erupted between the Bay Village Neighborhood Association, with prominent but not exclusively gay members, and the nightclubs Jacques, which predated the new residents, and the other side, the first gay disco in the city. And we see the two storefronts of the two venues in this image. So the other side appears on the right side in the background, Jacque's on the left side in the foreground. Jacque's on the other side served diverse, racially mixed, and working class clienteles that included gay men, lesbians, straights, transgender women, and drag queens, as well as sex workers and johns. Such venues faced debate about their right to exist and their clientele's place in the city. The other side closed in the mid-1970s as a casualty of the neighbors' lobbying, although residue of its signage remained visible for decades. Jacque's instead has persisted despite confrontations with residents that continued for decades during ongoing cycles of gentrification. Between the late 1950s and the 1970s, Boston underwent major urban renewal projects and gentrification in multiple neighborhoods. One of the first federal programs to fund the rebuilding of blighted inner cities targeted Boston's West End neighborhood, a low-rent district that was home to a working-class Italian population. The area was overzealously declared a slum in 1955 and razed completely by the decade's end. History repeated itself in Scollay Square, which for decades had functioned as Boston's unofficial but infamous adult entertainment zone. The city took a containment approach to zoning thereafter, forcing adult businesses into a strip called the Combat Zone. Although crime rates were actually lower than elsewhere in the city, the Combat Zone was widely understood as a failure of urban planning and city management. Though often elided in accounts of Boston's gay neighborhoods, Bay Village, sometimes called a poor man's Beacon Hill, began its transition from a low-rent district to a bastion of gay property renovations as early as the late 1950s. Only recently, after my book was already in print, did someone mention to me that he knew of the neighborhood by the nickname Gay Village, which also suggests a familiarity with this, even though whenever I would read about Boston, it was never named in lists of gay neighborhoods and concentrations. This process of gentrification started concurrently with the seizure and clearance of the West End, but via a different process. Bay Village is a small, central, mostly commercial neighborhood. By the 1970s, the residential options largely comprised rooming houses. The area, as I imagine many of you know, is nestled between the Boston Common to the north and the Mass Turnpike to the south, east of Back Bay and across the freeway from the south end. When the Mass Pike opened in 1957, it cut the neighborhood off from the adjoining area to the south, but it made the neighborhood more accessible to visitors from beyond the region. Some independent gay men renovated their homes and then strategically bought up other blighted houses to effectively claim the area. Gay renters also made improvements at their own expense and sweat equity with their landlord's permission. These early gay residents, who typically had limited incomes, simply wanted a place to live, where they would not encounter an atmosphere of social alienation. During the 1960s, realtors began to promote the neighborhood, recognizing and building upon gay men's renovations. The Bay Village Neighborhood Association formed to prevent the city from destroying the neighborhood as it had done to the West End and to Scollay Square. The BV&A would later lead the charge against area bars. Bay Village was home to a number of gay bars that had dated back decades and that preceded the in-migration of new gay homeowners. These included the Punch Bowl, Jacque's, and later the Other Side, all owned by Henry Vara. The Punch Bowl opened in 1946 as Vara's first gay venture and was known for its prominent neon marquee. It was raised to become a parking lot in 1969 as part of the South Cove Urban Renewal Plan. So we do see a number of venues in this area, in this neighborhood, were destroyed through urban renewal efforts. Jacque's opened as a small corner bar in the mid-1930s, went gay in the 1940s, and remains open as of this writing. The Other Side, located across Broadway from Jacque's, opened in 1965 and was the first gay disco in Boston. It won the legal right for same-sex dancing in 1968 and hosted famous drag shows starring the irascible Sylvia Sidney, among other queens. Mixed-class bars such as these and Playland in the Combat Zone were often characterized as more friendly and more inclusive than other gay bars in the city. Playland in particular drew a mixed clientele of downtown professionals, working-class patrons, and hustlers. Thus, business owners became the unlikely champions of the economically and socially marginalized. A few affectionate first-hand accounts vividly capture the scene. A 1972 National Gay Bar Guide describes Jacques this way, quote, "You'll find a colorful, wild mixture, genitally speaking, young and old, sleek and sleazy," end quote. Fag Reg characterized the other side as loud, active, quite a mixture. Straights come here to slum, end quote. Although the two clubs are often referenced in tandem, Jacques and the other side, acclaimed photographer Nan Golden conveys the other side's singularity. Her roommate and friends performed at the other side in the early 1970s. She went there 6 nights a week in 1972 to 1973, including for the weekly beauty parade modeling contests on Mondays and the bologna buffets on Thursdays. Police harassment in Boston had made public spaces dangerous for gender nonconforming people during the daytime, so her friends and roommates mostly stayed home or only went out at night to the club. Golden herself developed her art practice by photographing this scene. These photos now stand as vital documentation of this period and anchor her intimate photo series of drag queens and trans women titled for the club, The Other Side. In a later Boston Magazine profile of Jacques, the reporter recounts that the city and the Boston Redevelopment Agency had attempted to eradicate gay bars through urban renewal projects. Quote, "We will be better off without these incubators of homosexuality and indecency," one city councilor fumed publicly in 1965. "We must uproot these joints so innocent kids won't be contaminated." About a dozen bars were bulldozed in the ensuing revitalization. Somehow, Jacques survived and even expanded. In the mid-1970s, a writer for Gay Community News remarked that the bars Jacques and the Other Side are victims of change. 5 years ago, they were located in an entertainment district and not a residential neighborhood. The commentary continues. During this time, the bar's clientele also changed. Gays were attracted to new bars. Jacques and the Other Side became mixed, gay, straight, and bisexual, mostly from the working class. The bars adapted, the neighborhood did not. Lost in this struggle, however, are the gay people who work in and attend these bars. If the bars close, there will be nowhere else for these people to go. No other gay bar outside the combat zone welcomes transvestites and transsexuals, legitimate sexual minority members of our community. Critics of the neighborhood and the city efforts to close the bar down warned of the kind of displacement and community ruptures that Boston had already seen in the West End and Scollay Square. As the bar owners contended, the Boston Redevelopment Agency created the conditions that led to these tensions between residents and the bars. At the turn of the 1960s and into the 1970s, the Varas attempted to buy a tract of land from the city that would have allowed traffic to flow away from Bay Village. Instead, the city approved a development known as the 57 complex, which we see right here. It is now a hotel, but it had previously been a movie theater and shops. The 57 complex, which interrupted or vivisected, in one account, Broadway, a short and narrow street contrary to its name, between Park Square and the bars. The development was planted with its back to the bars and created an awkward 90-degree intersection around Jacques. As we can see here, that the sort of the urban planning and the urban design of the development prevented traffic flowing away this way or this way and created a bottleneck of parking and traffic around the bar that was a nuisance for neighborhood residents. This created congestion, noise, and parking nuisances for residents, as well as street crime, vandalism, loitering, and cross-class conflicts. The neighborhood fight against Jacques, the Other Side, and their clientele erupted concurrently with attention to the combat zone. the very existence of which raised the idea that all such businesses should be moved and contained within it. But cities are porous, and people navigate and make use of urban space in ways that defy zoning. Jacques and the other side were both within walking distance of the club baths in the combat zone, and also a short drive from the cruising area known as the Block, which drew men from outside the city center in their cars. Bay Village's proximity to highways effectively opened the area to non-residents looking for a good time or looking for some trouble. Asserting the importance of nuance, Christina B. Handhart argues that gay gentrification is not a homogeneous force, but one that selectively constructs and exploits the desirability of a certain type of gay resident: white, affluent, normative, and discreet. Quote, by the start of the 1970s, popular acceptance of homosexuality had grown, and realtors began marketing gay people as the ideal tenants of changing neighborhoods, focusing especially on middle-class white gay men as high-earning, risk-taking, and family-free. But in an important distinction, the celebration of renters and owners did not include those whose displays of queerness primarily took the form of public intimacy, gender nonconformity, or participation in street-based economies. End quote. These latter forms of queer public life are precisely what the attacks on Jacques were attempting to police. Whatever the drivers of in-migration, gentrification manifests in complex ways that erode prior community norms and contacts, and that make new tensions visible. Importantly, the nightclubs in this chapter not only navigated changing urban landscapes, but also reconceptualizations of the queer community. Jacques and the other side demonstrate the duality of bars as community sanctuaries and as hunting grounds for homophobes, and raise questions about bar owners' responsibilities both to their patrons and their neighbors. But most of all, they expose and reinforce intra-community divisions within the gay community about who is enfranchised and who is marginalized. What makes Boston such a rich case study is that the battle over Jacques and other venues produced extraordinary and ongoing debates about the place of gay bars in the community and whose interests the bars served. I learned of these bars and the discussions surrounding them because they were extensively reported and commented upon in gay community news, which the History Project has just done a series of events celebrating its 50th anniversary, a collectively run newspaper with a leftist orientation. Its journalistic quality distinguished it as one of the most indispensable gay publications to emerge in the 1970s. In her witty memoir of her time at GCN, which was after the peak of the bar battles, Amy Hoffman reflects on the newspaper's complex relationships to the bars. Quote, GCN had been founded in part as a protest against gay bars, whose straight, possibly mafia owners profited from our oppression. Gay bars were dark, expensive, and unhealthy. They encouraged alcoholism, shame, and the life of the closet. They were secret, romantic, and fun. You never knew what would happen or who you would meet. We criticized them, but at night we patronized them every chance we got. Neighborhood complaints against Jacques and the other side apparently started in 1971, although GCN did not begin publication until 1973. Yet, from its first year in print, the bars made front-page news for complaints about late-night noise, violence, and corruption, and the Boston Licensing Board's shifting regulations for the bar's hours of service. Even the flagship daily newspaper Boston Globe covered the brouhaha surrounding Jacques and the other side, along with our co-owners Henry and Carmine Vara and manager Frank Cashman, far beyond what I've seen for gay bars in any other city. Henry Vara, in particular, became a lightning rod for press attention, especially by Globe political columnist David Farrell, who seemed fixated on him as a public enemy. Rumors also circulated that Vara had Chester Wolfe, the owner of the rival gay bar Sporters, murdered, and that Vara's mother was thrown out of a window to her death in retribution. Jacques, on the other side, effectively appeared as symbols of a class struggle in the pages of GCN, for little coverage spoke from the perspectives of the actual people who frequent these clubs. The GCN embraced these bars' patrons as the lumpen proletariat of the gay community, whereas the Globe characterized them as the undesirables of the gay community, effectively saying the same thing from a different ideological vantage point. In 1971, a woman writing to the local Daughters of Bilitis journal complained that Jacques was one of the few venues frequented by women, but that these women were freaks, and the club was a long-wasting, depressing, demoralizing, degrading sideshow. The chairman of the Massachusetts Alcoholic Beverages Control Commission remarked to the Globe in 1975 that the bars were, quote, designed to cater to homosexuals, male and female prostitutes, transvestites, exhibitionists, and other exotics, who in turn attract thieves, drug users, pushers, ruffians, rowdies, and voyeurs to their social netherworld, which to me sounds like a lot of fun. But what emerges from the gay press reporting is that transgender and sex worker clientele in particular were being targeted under the guise of noise and violence complaints. Public debate about these venues and reporting from the time often used the term drag queen to interchangeably reference show performers, cross-dressers, and trans female sex workers. As the controversy, including allegations of classism within the gay community, escalated, Gay Community News published a center-spread debate with long commentaries on the bars. Taking the pro position, Charlie Shively contextualized the predicament within a longer process of gentrification in the neighborhood, indeed the whole city. He writes, quote, since World War II, there has been a campaign against all poor people in Boston. He observed that Bay Village had been a nightlife district with gay venues dating back to the 1920s and 30s, as well as having a now decades-long history of bulldozing those sites. Shively argued that the banks were the real benefactors of gentrification. Property values in the neighborhood had increased tenfold. He then alleged that the uptick in violence in the area, dating from 1971, was actually a police and private interest campaign against queer, trans, and poor people. He continues, quote, they say gay leaders, Village Association, Barney Frank, who was then still closeted, and the police even, that they only oppose the criminal elements of the gay community, that is, the poor elements such as hustlers or street transvestites or noisy faggots and dykes who don't have big paying jobs, forcing them to be closety. They would divide us into good gays and trashy gays. No wonder most people in the bars don't trust anything connected with gay liberation, end quote. And that's actually a discourse I've seen in a number of different cities, is these tensions between the activists and the politics of gay liberation actually comes into tension with bar patrons, particularly in working class bars, who rejected the sort of the political movements of the liberationists of the time. David Brill, taking the position in this debate in GCN, argued that the bars were corrupt and made gays into sitting ducks. Quote, what have the bars done for gay people? With the unasked for assistance of the straight media, they have afforded the opportunity for every homophobe and fag roller in the city to have a field day. Brill likewise painted a vivid scene for neighborhood residents. Quote, as citizens of Boston, they have the right to live wherever they please and should not have to put up with passed-out bodies in their doorways reeking of beer and seeping in urine, with flying bullets and blood-stained sidewalks, or with police, prostitutes, and pieces of glass at their front doors at all hours, end quote. The bar's owners would refute much of the coverage and allegations against the bars in a letter to the editor of GCN, pointing out that prostitution and crime rates near the bars were actually lower than other parts of the city. They also pointed out that their adjoining neighbors had not complained about noise except for voices during the nightly closing time exit. Most nuisance complaints, they alleged, came from residents 3 or more blocks away. Complicating any clear determination of these venues' culpability most of the incidents that drew neighbors' ire did not happen on the club's premises, but in their general vicinity. Thus, the bars were accused of being magnets for undesirables. Whereas GCN focused on community bias against the bar's clientele, the Boston Globe's coverage sensationalized the bar's role in street violence. Gay bars, gay cruising areas, and gay neighborhoods everywhere serve simultaneously as sites for community formation and as places where the visibility of queer people exposes them to potential violence. Police Superintendent Joseph Jordan suggested that these bars should be shut down because they attracted youths from South Boston who traveled to them in order to assault patrons and people in the surrounding area. Jacques, on the other side, did hire security in the form of off-duty police, and the tactical police force made nightly visits to the venues. These bars were criticized as both excessive drains on police resources and as using their influence to minimize police report filings on incidents in the area. Community complaints and charges against the bars ranged from double parking, vandalism, and late-night noise after closing time, to multiple counts of assault and battery with a weapon, assault with intent to murder a police officer, and shooting of a bystander while police attempted to break up a brawl. A particularly gruesome homicide of a young Latino man was spawned by a brawl in one of the bars, which ended when a group of white toughs slashed the victim's throat before crushing his head with a rock. This murder, in turn, prompted more than 150 local residents to protest for the closure of Vara's bars. Although the Bay Village Neighborhood Association was the most organized voice representing homeowners' grievances against the bars, a competing neighborhood group, the Bay Village Neighborhood Association, Inc., sponsored a rally with 100 participants in support of the bars a week later. Perhaps deliberately creating confusion, the two opposing groups' names were distinguished only by the word Inc. One reporter cheekily differentiated the two by adding unincorporated to the name of the original group. Such discourses of public safety reflect critiques of these issues by Christina Hanhart and Lam Hay. Hanhart suggests that in the 1970s, new residents would demand policing in transitioning neighborhoods, which signaled a new claim over space, a new sense of certain neighborhoods as sites of precarity and protection, and new rationalizations about who belonged in these spaces and who did not. Conversely, Hay argues that nightlife should be noisy and disorderly in order to provide the kind of socialization that is unique to it, and which is required to nurture creative, transgressive, and countercultural subcultures. However, she finds that during the quality of life era, starting in the 1990s, and in the midst of gentrification, these ordinary features of nightlife were not only decried as nuisances, but also newly became punished as crimes. In spring 1975, more than 15 hearings extended over the course of 4 weeks to determine the legal fate of Jacque and the other side. The hearings responded to 27 complaints against the bars, including serving minors, on-site drug violations, overcrowding, patrons leaving with alcoholic beverages, firearms violations, and disorderly persons. The bars were also under separate police investigation for 3 months for alleged criminal activities. Upping the drama, during this same period, Jacques experienced an electrical fire. Its manager, Frank Cashman, was alleged to have extorted the mayor for $50,000. The venues were revealed to owe more than $80,000 in taxes, and owner Vara filed for bankruptcy. All of this provided fodder for muckraking and for political commentary. In the wake of the hearings, Jacques and the other side were ordered to relocate, which they did not, and to curtail their hours of operation, closing earlier than other establishments with liquor licenses, which they did. Residents claimed that the early closing time significantly reduced area noise, traffic, crime, and prostitution. it also drastically reduced the bar's revenues. But even these attempts at controlling the clubs became ineffectual, as the local Boston Licensing Board and the State Beverages Control Commission disputed which had jurisdiction to regulate them. Gay Community News reported that the state agency cleared the bars of all legal barriers to remain open and strongly suggested that the city had no authority to limit their hours. Perhaps most significantly, state commissioners argued that people who moved into this area certainly were aware of the existence of these two nightclubs. Thus, state authorities ruled 2-1 that the bars were grandfathered by operating within a de facto combat zone and by preceding the new residents. As GCN commentators saw it, Jacques on the other side provided a community service that would have to be otherwise addressed if the bars were to close. Quote, "There remains a need which will not go away with the destruction of the bars or the destruction of their neighborhood. If the bars do not, cannot, or ought not to fulfill these needs, someone must. And if these needs are important to gay people, the gay community must accept that challenge," end quote. Again, the gay bar became the site for political debate, policy, and recognize who constitutes or is excluded from the gay community. In the absence of any other infrastructures, gay bars became social services. After a decade as the city's leading gay disco and drag venue, the other side was ultimately forced to close in 1976 because of ongoing noise complaints. The drag shows moved to Jacques. Jacques has survived with uncommon tenacity, despite being repeatedly targeted by neighborhood residents and the city in subsequent decades. People have been trying to close down Jacques for as long as it has existed, wrote one press report. In coverage of the bars, these efforts were explicitly connected to gentrification and issues of quality of life for residents. In 1984, Jacques was charged with unlawfully permitting dancing after 46 years of allowing dancing, and despite having an entertainment license. So this bar has repeatedly been targeted in ways that sort of defy sort of the ways in which it actually is permitted and regulated legally. Henry Vara reportedly left the bar business finally in 1989. Yet, in 2010, the Boston Herald reported that Henry Vara is back. But he never went away. Boston's legendary czar of multiple gin mills and flush pots has popped up before the licensing board once again to further torment the residents of Bay Village. This time, however, neighborhood residents complained that it was women who flocked to Jacques for bachelorette shows Friday and Saturday nights that have been barfing up a storm on the streets and in flower pots. Regulators defended the venue on the basis that it had been one of the few bars in Boston where Blacks, Hispanics, and whites mix easily and where there are both men and women. The local chapter of Black and White Men Together concurred when it released a study of racial discrimination at gay bars. Although several bars were cited for racism, Jacques was not. In the mid-2000s, a Boston Magazine writer affirmed that Jacques was still a cherished oddity that sticks out in a largely segregated Boston, a place where gay, straight, Black, Asian, white, old, lesbian, transgender, Hispanic, transsexual, and anyone and everyone who denies or defies a label can come together for a drink. The reporter then proceeds to portray the venue as seedy, describing the scene of cruising, hustling, and solicitation. Pointing to decades-long tensions between the venue and its neighbors, the article continues, quote, "This is the tale of two neighborhoods, which just happen to both occupy the same physical space. Following the South End's lead, Bay Village has become increasingly attractive to professionals priced out of Beacon Hill and the Back Bay. Some of them are gay themselves and even moved here for its reputation for tolerance." Once again, the Bay Village Neighborhood Association claimed that because some of its members were gay, it could not be biased against the bar. Going further, a representative argued that, quote, "If there's any discrimination, is the attitude of the licensing board that the whores have to be somewhere, and it might as well be the fags that have to deal with it. That's the reality I perceive, end quote. Bars acted as beacons and anchors for the development of gay entertainment districts, which often evolved into residential neighborhoods. Boston was unique both in its containment approach to zoning adult businesses, and in how early and vociferously class tensions erupted between gay homeowners and queer bar patrons over who could claim rights to their neighborhood. Similar processes have triggered cycles of gentrification in cities across the country, and later in migrants, in turn, contest the nightlife that founded their neighborhood's culture. Although I personally became aware of debates about gay neighborhoods, bars, and gentrification only at the turn of the millennium, my research has revealed that these issues were debated in thoughtful and charged ways decades earlier, as in the case of Bay Village in Boston. My takeaway is that we have so much to learn from the archive and the gay press from our collective history. And that's the end of my presentation here. Before we go to Q&A, I just want to sort of plug, my website has a number of features that supplement the book, including playlists both on YouTube and Spotify with music referenced in the book. There's a gallery of additional images beyond what's in the book. And there's also a page on my website that is for people to share their own experiences with bars, share their stories, and then I'll post it in a blog format on another page of the book. And there's also a couple of discount codes that the press that published my book is offering. So I'm going to leave those up there for right now in case anyone's interested in getting a sale copy of the book. But I'm very happy to hear your stories in conversation and to field any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Lucas. This is really, really cool. Really good. I suspect that people are ready to chime in with some opinions and some stories themselves. If anybody would like to put a question in the chat, you can do that. If you'd like to ask a question on camera, you can just unmute yourself, maybe raise your hand, and we can do it that way. Lucas, to start off, can you talk about what else you're covering in the book? I know you're doing many different cities, and Boston is fairly early in the book. And what sort of other topics and what sort of other sort of thesis are you sort of working towards?
Yeah, so the book has 8 different chapters. So there's 8 cities that are profiled in the book. And one of the things that was really important to me is that we understand gay bar history as existing beyond New York and San Francisco. So it's obviously those cities are in the book, but it was really important to me that we didn't reduce gay bar history to those 2 cities. So the book begins in Chicago with the history of the leather bar, the invention of leather bar cultures, with a particular focus on the Gold Coast in Chicago. There's a chapter on drag and its emergence as a gay bar staple, focusing on Kansas City. The third chapter is Boston, looking at gentrification. There's a chapter on Atlanta, looking at histories of discrimination in the gay bar scene, activism to address discrimination. And what ultimately manifested in Atlanta was that there wasn't so much integration of the bars despite successful activism. So the city council actually changed the laws to integrate the bars in Atlanta. But instead of socially integrating, what happened is that we see the emergence of a parallel Black gay bar scene in Atlanta. So the bars effectively remained distinct and segregated socially. Then I look at sex clubs, bathhouses, and discos in New York. I look at a bar in Houston that was really the center of community organizing. In San Francisco, I look at generational tensions that erupted in the late 80s and early 90s between the Stonewall generation and the Gen Xers, who had a fundamentally different historical relationship to gay nightlife and to gay sex, largely based upon who came of age before AIDS and who came of age with AIDS and sort of their different relationships there. And it sort of maps onto a cultural and political shift from a gay identity to a queer identity. And then the Los Angeles chapter looks at Latinx clubs and bars in Los Angeles. And then the book ends with an epilogue focusing on Pulse and sort of the tributes and the rethinking and the reassessment of gay bars that happens in the wake of the tragedy of Pulse. Then in between chapters, there's these little mini chapters, which are interludes about other cities or other archival findings or nights out on the town that explore different questions and different ways of thinking about bars without it being sort of as long and belabored as some of the chapters are.
Excellent. Okay, we do have a question. Lucas, were you surprised by anything you learned in researching Boston gay bar history?
Yeah, so I think what was a couple of things that really stood out to me in doing the research on Boston. So I knew when I started the book would talk about gentrification in some way. It was one of the topics that just seemed inevitable in terms of the debates around gay bars and their relationship to their neighborhoods and the idea of a gayborhood or a gay ghetto. What I didn't necessarily expect was that Boston was a city where there was the most rich archive, largely because of gay community news, that there was so much attention to these issues, but also what surprised me in Boston specifically was how much earlier this had happened than any other city I looked at. So it was something that I sort of, I knew San Francisco had gone through cycles of gentrification later on, but Boston actually was really, really important for the book in terms of giving me a lot of language and sort of an exemplary debate around this particular topic, but also because both Gay Community News and Fag Rag were such like smart and militant publications that they really gave thoughtful and really well-developed attention to what was happening in Boston. And I think as I've talked to both Michael Bronski and also reading Amy Hoffman's book, really understanding that the relationship between the gay press, the bars, and activists was really, really integrated. So I knew that the gay press emerged and was only possible early on because of gay bar ads. Gay bar ads basically financed and supported the emergence of the gay press in cities across the country. But learning sort of how completely integrated they were in terms of the staff of the newspapers going out to the bars together, sort of after wrapping each issue. And that sort of, it was just so fully ingrained in their lives that sort of, it was really important the ways in which bars sort of really did function as fully integrated into people's lives and understanding about gay public life, but also understanding those neighborhoods. So what surprised me, I think, about Boston, which is how rich that story was and how much material there was, but also how GCN, I still think, is probably the best gay newspaper that has existed in the country, because it had such extraordinary coverage of what was happening.
Absolutely. Okay, we have another question. In addition to archival press articles, did you use first-person accounts for the research?
So different cities had different ways of conveying this history. So Boston, most of my material comes from gay press reporting, and largely because it was actually so well articulated and so developed, and there's actually so much writing in the gay press. I did less oral history or less sort of first-person account interviewing for Boston than I did for some of the other cities because I already had so much material. And so many of the articles were already voiced from a first person on the ground in the moment point of view. There were other cities where the archive was relatively thin. So Atlanta, for instance, has an extraordinarily well-documented history of activists responding to discrimination and influencing city council to pass new municipal codes. But in terms of the emergent Black gay bar scene, there was very little in the archive documenting those bars and those spaces. So that chapter took more conversation to develop those stories and to get a better sense both of those spaces, but also sort of who used them, where were they located, how did they sort of play a role in people's lives. So certain cities and certain questions or certain bars necessitated more interviews than others. So Boston, in many ways, sort of the archive was so rich that there was less interviewing there, but I did have conversations with Michael Bronsky in particular about what was happening in Boston. So thank you for your questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And any other questions, or if anybody has a story about any of the bars mentioned, or just about being around at this time period, or questions about the book in general.
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear your stories, because I'm writing this as someone who's never lived in Boston. So and so many of you actually sort of know these neighborhoods and know this history probably better than I do.
Yes, you have a question. Chuck, you can unmute yourself, I think.
Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm in San Diego, California, and it's not a question. It's just a story of what's happening now in San Diego's Hillcrest area, which is the LGBTQ area.
Yeah.
It's going through its own planning revitalization, where density is proposed to be increased to bring in, I don't know, approximately 30,000 new residents in that particular area. And the gay bars are strongly in favor of that development. And in fact, the planning is focused on something called the LGBTQ Cultural District, which is kind of mimicking what's happened in San Francisco, a little bit of Boys Town in Chicago, et cetera. And then you have others in the community who are opposed to the densification at the highest level that is being proposed, 20-story tall towers in a much more moderate condition at the moment. And one of the interesting aspects of the gay bar support of the densification is their dislike of any kind of historic designation of LGBTQ sites. So I'm just wondering if in your research you came across anything similar to that. Of course, that's more contemporary than in the 70s, but I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, certainly these questions are cyclical, and so they keep recurring in different ways and in different cities and different economic realities. So yeah, I'm based in Los Angeles. California-wide, there's a housing crisis, and there's such a push to build more housing, particularly high density housing. We see it in Los Angeles, we see it throughout California. We're also seeing it in other cities across the country. But what you're describing most closely resembles what I learned about when I visited Dallas for research. So Dallas, I would actually say, has the most thriving gay bar district in the country, or at least it did as of 2017 when I was there for research. And what's interesting with Dallas, and I met with the Merchants Association person from the gay neighborhood, and he said that they had actually studied other cities like San Francisco and Chicago, and cities that had seen intense gentrification of the gay neighborhoods that had effectively changed the character of those neighborhoods. That sort of overdevelopment and big box stores had really decimated the sense of community and the street life of those communities. And so they had actually worked very hard to lobby and influence the city and the zoning to protect the integrity of that neighborhood, to prevent big box stores from coming in and to prevent high-rise condo developments coming in. Since that time, the largest owner of gay bars there, Cavin Industries, which is a corporation that owns multiple bars in Dallas, had, and is also employee owned, so it's a cooperative company, actually got involved in the development of a condo high rise, but sort of on the terms that were set by the bar owners themselves. So the bar owners were really centrally involved in city planning and in development and in zoning in that particular city, with the particular mindset of finding ways to sort of sustain the culture of the gay neighborhood and the bar district, while also recognizing the need for housing development. So it sounds like what is happening in San Diego, and this is my first time hearing this specifically about San Diego, it sounds like it's actually a strong parallel what's happened in Dallas in recent years.
So I'd love to get another question. We are coming up on 8 o'clock, and we usually do try to end close to 8 to respect people's time, everyone's time. But is there anybody else who would like to comment or ask a question? Yeah, this is a good question. Thank you, Raul. This is what do you believe
It's
is
the
the
future
future
of gay
of
bars.
gay bars? Yeah. And in your introduction, I think it's in your introduction, you talk a little bit about the pandemic and about how it's too soon to really sort of see what the effect has been or will be ultimately. But I wondered, similarly, has your thinking changed at all or evolved at all about that since you wrote the book?
Yeah, so I mean, so the way the timeline with book publishing is I finished writing it about a year ago. And you can tweak little things in the production cycle. But so what I would say a few things about the present and future of the gay bar. So numerically, we've seen a lot of bar closures in the last 20 years. In the last 5 to 10 years in particular, there's been a precipitous drop in the number of gay bars. But what we also are seeing, even within the last year, so in this sort of post-COVID moment, we are actually seeing new bars opening, not to the number of the bars that we've lost. But I think that we're in this moment post-COVID that people during the pandemic and during the bar closures really recognized the loss and the need for these kinds of public spaces. And so I think we're seeing a new moment of wanting to recapture and rebuild some of those spaces. But I think we're also at a moment of reimagining what those spaces do and what they're like. So they're not necessarily opening in ways that reproduce the old model of the gay bar, but they're maybe imagining sort of what is a gay bar now. And it's still a little too early to predict what the future is. But I think we're in this interesting moment of potential to redefine and have a more expansive or a broader range of what the gay bar might be, but also imagine more broadly who it might serve. So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah. I know here in Boston, very anecdotally, as bars have been closing up until very recently, and yet I think that there's a huge increase in the number of like queer nights at different bars or different types of venues, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if nobody has any other questions, I think we'll leave it here. Thank you so much, Lucas. This has been really good. Congratulations on the book. And I hope everybody will pick it up. It's really interesting. It's really good. Thank you, everyone, too, for coming to tonight's event. And I hope we'll get to see you online or in person at another event. Thanks. Have a good night.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay.